Hello students, in today's lecture we will be talking about the process of pollination. It is one of the important topics from the chapter Sexual Reproduction in Flowering Plants. So what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of a flower. Okay, this is pollination. Now pollination is different from fertilization. It occurs before fertilization. Pollination, it is of two types: self pollination and cross pollination. What is self pollination? When the transfer of pollen grains take place from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or two different flowers but from the same plant, it is called as self pollination. So the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of same flower or different flowers of same plant. ठीक है, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Understood? What is cross pollination? That is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of two different plants of same species. Let's understand. Cross pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of two different plants. So here the flowers are from the two different plants but from the same species. Understood? That is called as cross pollination. And if it is between the same flower or the different flowers of the same plant, it is the self pollination. Now self pollination is of two types: autogamy, Geitonogamy. Now what is autogamy? When the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma take place within the same flower, it is called as autogamy. For autogamy to take place, understand, if the transfer is taking place within the same flower, that means the anther, that means the male and the female reproductive structures, both has to be close enough for the pollination to take place, and also they should mature at the same time. So the condition is that the anther, means the stamen, and carpel should mature at same time and they should be close enough for the pollination to take place. Okay, so since it is the pollination is occurring within the same flower, so it creates a genetic purity. There is no variation, okay, genetic purity. Since it is occurring within the same flower, there is no external agent called as pollinator. is required. This makes sense, right? Since it is within the same flower, there is no need of any external agent for the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Those external agents are called as pollinators. The examples are pea, wheat, rice. Now we'll talk about Geitonogamy. So Geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of two different flowers, but for the same plant. So within the plant we have multiple flowers, okay. So here the transfer is taking place from one flower to the another, but in the same plant. So the Geitonogamy flowers, they are genetically similar to Autogamy, since it is happening within the same plant. So there is no genetic variation, okay, between different flowers of same plant, okay. So here they are genetically similar to Autogamous flower, ठीक है. यहाँ पे here the pollinators are required. Since it is occurring between the two different flowers, so the pollen has to transfer something, some carrier, some pollinator is needed for the transfer, to help in the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of two different flowers. So here the pollinators are needed, okay. So the example is maize, cucurbita and castor, okay. Now we'll move to a very important part, that is the cross pollination. The cross pollination type is called as Xenogamy. It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of two different plants of the same species, okay. It is happening between the same species but between two different plants, okay. So it is an example of true cross pollination. This will also lead to genetic variation, since it is occurring between two different plants, and these genetic variations are going to be helpful in the process of evolution, because genetic variation will help the plant to survive in the different climatic conditions. Overall, it is going to help in the process of evolution. The examples are Vallisneria papaya, okay. Now this Geitonogamy flower, it is genetically similar to Autogamy. Why? Because it is happening between the same plant, different flowers but with the same plant. So it is genetically similar to Autogamy, but it is functionally similar to Xenogamy, because it is occurring between the two different flowers, okay. So don't be confused. Geitonogamy, it is genetically similar to Autogamy, but it is functionally similar to Xenogamy, okay. Now I'll revise it once again. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower. It is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is again of two types, Autogamy and Geitonogamy. If the transfer is taking place between the same flower, Autogamy, between the different flowers of the same plant, Geitonogamy. Autogamy will lead to genetic purity. Autogamy will lead to the genetic purity. Geitonogamy, here it will not have a genetic variation, understand, because it is happening within the same plant. So again, Geitonogamy, it is genetically similar to autogamy, functionally similar to xenogamy. What is xenogamy? The pollination that is occurring between the two different plants of the same species. So it's a true cross pollination. It will create genetic variation and it will help in the process of evolution. Next, we'll talk about the different types of flower based on whether they have an exposed or they have an inert reproductive structures. So based on that, we have two different type of flowers. One is called as the Chasmogamous flower and the another one is called as the Cleistogamous flower. So let's get to know each of it. What is Chasmogamous flower? Chasmogamous is when the reproductive structures of a flower, when the reproductive structures means your carpel and stamen is exposed. Okay, exposed. So when this condition will occur? This will happen when the flower is completely open. So here the flower is fully open. So since the flower is open, the reproductive structures are clearly visible. So here there is a chance that it can opt for either self or cross pollination. Both the chances are possible, whether it can have either self or cross pollination. That means it can have autogamy, Geitonogamy and Xenogamy. Okay, so here there is a possibility of having autogamy, Geitonogamy or Xenogamy. Second, since here the pollination can be a cross pollination, therefore pollinators are required. Okay, and the examples are mustard, lily, hibiscus. Okay, then we have the Cleistogamous flower. Cleistogamous flowers are those where the reproductive structures, they are closed, they are not visible. So here the reproductive structures are closed, they are not visible from outside, and this is why, because the flower is always closed. The flower is closed. So since the flower is always closed, so it is the pollination will always happen since the flower is closed. Okay, so inside the pollens will always get transferred to the stigma and it will carry out the process of pollination. So it ensures the pollination. So here the pollination is ensured. So because of that, in Cleistogamous flower there is seed formation always occurs, and since there will never be a cross pollination, always be a self pollination, so it creates a genetic purity. There won't be any variation because there won't be any cross pollination. So here it always shows autogamy, that is always fertilization is self-fertilization. Okay, it is occurring inside the flower. Okay, the example is viola and oxalis. So here we have talked about two different type of flowers based on whether they have an exposed and or closed reproductive structure. We have Chasmogamous, where the reproductive structure is exposed because the flower is fully open. So here there is a possibility of self or cross pollination. Therefore autogamous, geitonogamy or xenogamy, anything can happen. The pollinators are required since they can be an geitonogamy or xenogamy. So pollinators are required. Example is mustard, lily and hibiscus. On the other hand, Cleistogamous is when the reproductive structures are not visible, the flower is fully closed. So here the pollination is always ensured, so seed will always form. So it will create a genetic purity, there won't be any variation. There is no cross pollination, there is no geitonogamy, so here pollinators are not required. There is always autogamous. Okay, the example is viola and oxalis. Now in the next we'll talk about the different type of pollinating agents. So if you like my video, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.